The RMS Aquitania was more than a ship, she was a floating testament to Edwardian excess, a palace of steel intended to eclipse her famous sisters. On this chilly morning in 1907, she loomed majestically, her enormous, polished black funnels, a promise of speed and luxury, cutting through the grey Liverpool sky. Below, on the promenade deck, the air thrummed with the excitement of an Atlantic crossing. Among the privileged few boarding the first-class gangway were Lord Alaric Vane and his new bride, Lady Seraphine. Lord Alaric, a man whose fortune was built on the grim efficiency of textiles, looked oddly shrunken beside his own wealth. He wore a heavy suit, less a symbol of his station and more a cumbersome armor against the anxieties that gnawed at him. His face, normally stern, held a pallor that spoke of sleepless nights. He was a man already defeated, seeking only to endure the 6-day journey to New York. Seraphine, however, was a figure of cold, striking vitality. Her outfit was an architectural marvel of silk and lace, topped by a hat of outrageous proportion, crowned with improbable ostrich plumes. Her hand rested lightly on her husband's arm, a public display of ownership that felt, to the casual observer, like devotion. Yet, the keen eye could spot the precise geometry of her movements, calculated, never spontaneous. She had married the Vane name and fortune, and now she treated her husband like an essential, though aging, asset. Dr. Silas Mirth, a specialist in nerve disorders and a quiet, unassuming man, watched the couple from the deck below. He was merely a physician returning home, yet he possessed the clinical detachment of someone trained to see beneath the surface. He noticed the tightness around Alaric's jaw, and the way Seraphine's smile didn't quite reach the flat, grey focus of her eyes. He filed the observation away. Simply two more souls bound for the new world, one desperate for arrival, the other, Mirth instinctively felt, already planning her departure. The ship's horn sounded, a mournful, deep bellow, signaling their departure into the churning waters and, unbeknownst to all but one, into a gathering tragedy. Lord Alaric Vane saw the RMS Aquitania not as a marvel of engineering, but as a fast-moving coffin. His vast fortune, built upon the exploitation of cotton mills and the ruthless undercutting of competitors, felt like a lead weight pressing him down, suffocating him with obligations he no longer possessed the will to meet. He was rich beyond measure, yet utterly bankrupt of happiness. His latest acquisition, his wife Seraphine, was meant to revive him, to inject the vibrant energy of youth and social grace into his dusty existence. Instead, she was merely another polished object he owned, albeit one with a chillingly cold interior. Alaric recognized, with mounting dread, the profound mistake he had made in marrying her. He had sought companionship, she had sought control. His wealth was her cage key, and she rattled it constantly. The doctor, Silas Mirth, would later learn that Alaric suffered from aquaphobia, a crippling fear of deep water, ironic for a man whose commerce was intrinsically linked to the sea. This voyage was a terrible ordeal, endured solely at Seraphine's insistence. As the ship pulled away from the safe harbor, Alaric retreated to a secluded corner of the smoking room, gripping a glass of brandy with a tremor that betrayed his facade of upper-class stoicism. He was a man consumed by his past, weighed down by the knowledge that every luxury he possessed was bought with the meager wages and broken health of his workers. This crossing was not a vacation, it was a desperate, final retreat. He felt utterly isolated, the ship's opulence mocking his inner despair. He desperately wished for solid ground, but all he could see through the porthole was the churning, indifferent grey of the Atlantic, a mirror to his own soul. He didn't realize that his profound unhappiness was precisely what made him a vulnerable target. Lady Seraphine Vane was a study in controlled artifice. Her striking appearance, defined by the impossibly large hat trailing black ostrich plumes, was less a fashion statement and more a deliberate barrier, designed to keep the world at a calculated distance. She understood that in the grand theater of Edwardian society, visibility was power, but mystery was absolute control. Born to a family whose lineage was long but whose bank accounts were conspicuously short, Seraphine had been raised with the singular ambition of marrying wealth. Lord Alaric Vane was not her love, but her most spectacular conquest. Their marriage was a transaction, one she was determined to see through to its profitable conclusion. She bore his tedious company and his increasingly desperate complaints with the serene patience of a predator. What few observers understood was the steel beneath the silk. Seraphine was intensely, chillingly meticulous. She drew no satisfaction from frivolity. Her only pleasure lay in planning, in the flawless execution of a complex strategy. Her habit of sketching the crew, which many took as an aristocratic eccentricity, was actually an exercise in observation. She was cataloguing faces, recording patterns, and ensuring her own image was consistent and unremarkable in the recollections of others. As the Aquitania cleaved through the waves, Seraphine stood at the rail, the plumes of her hat fluttering slightly in the breeze. She looked ahead, not at the vast ocean, but at the horizon of her future, a future she intended to mold with the Vane fortune as her clay. The ship's crossing was merely a timeline, a countdown to her liberation. She had endured enough of Alaric's coldness and the demeaning nature of her purchased status. She desired not just his money, but the utter freedom that only widowhood could provide. She checked her small, velvet handbag, feeling the reassuring hardness of a small glass vial within, a medical item obtained under the guise of treating her husband's persistent headaches. The sea, she knew, was a far more efficient undertaker than any physician. Dr. Silas Mirth was a man whose profession had trained him to see not the surface of things, but the fissures beneath. A specialist in the nervous system, he dealt in the truth that lay between the conscious thought and the involuntary twitch, the polite smile and the dilated pupil. On the RMS Aquitania, he was enjoying a rare period of professional stillness, yet his mind remained quietly active, a meticulous instrument constantly taking readings. He found the Vane couple to be the most compelling, if disturbing, case study aboard. He had observed their interactions during dinner. Lord Alaric's forced pleasantries ending mid-sentence, his nervous habit of clearing his throat, and Lady Seraphine's unnerving stillness, her movements precise, almost mechanical. She possessed a terrifying self-control that Mirth instinctively categorized as a symptom, not a virtue. One afternoon, Mirth passed Seraphine on the lounge deck, where she was absorbed in sketching. He stopped, feigning interest in the ship's architecture. Seraphine gave him a cool, brief glance. The subject of her charcoal sketch was not the sea or a fellow passenger, but a junior steward, a meticulous, detailed rendering of the young man's face, captured with professional anatomical accuracy. It wasn't the work of an idle amateur, it was the work of someone who studied human vulnerabilities. Mirth noticed something else unsettling, the complete absence of genuine connection between the couple. They spoke at each other, never with shared warmth. They walked side by side but resided in separate realities. Alaric sought escape in his increasingly heavy drinking. Seraphine sought escape in her chilling, calculating solitude. Mirth found himself troubled by the thought that something vital was missing from their relationship. Not love, which was often absent in such marriages, but basic human empathy. It was this lack of feeling, this cold vacuum at the heart of their union, that alerted Mirth's professional instincts. He had witnessed the subtle signs of a relationship that was not merely unhappy, but dangerously volatile, like an explosive device with a slow-burning fuse. The morning of the third day brought with it an unnatural, ominous quiet. The boisterous rolling waves that had defined the first 2 days of the Atlantic crossing vanished, replaced by a sea of slate-gray flatness. Then, the fog descended. It was not the ephemeral mist of a summer dawn, but a thick, wet, cold vapor that rolled over the RMS Aquitania like a vast, suffocating tide. Within minutes, the world outside the ship's rails simply ceased to exist. The sky vanished, the horizon dissolved, and even the tops of the massive funnels were swallowed whole, leaving only the sound of the ship's own machinery and the ominous, heavy silence of the air. The atmosphere on board changed instantaneously. The frivolous chatter of the passengers died down, card games were abandoned, and a strange collective tension settled over the decks. The fog was a psychological force, a physical manifestation of isolation. It dampened all external noise, turning the enormous, bustling liner into a closed, echoing box. Conversations became hushed, and footsteps seemed to press closer to the wooden deck. Dr. Silas Mirth stood on the starboard side, feeling the damp chill seep into his overcoat. He noted how the fog diffused the light, giving everything, faces, railings, polished brass, a ghastly, monochromatic pallor. It was an environment that seemed to encourage secrets and mask intentions. No one could see beyond a few feet. No one could hear anything over the low, constant moan of the ship's warning horn, a sound that felt less like a safety measure and more like a funereal lament. It was into this perfect, disorienting shroud of grey that Lord Alaric Vane emerged, guided by the hand of Lady Seraphine. They walked onto the promenade deck, drawn by some inexplicable, shared need to face the unseeable void. The stage was set, isolated, silent, and utterly concealed from the wider world. The promenade deck was sparsely populated, the few figures pressed against the rail appearing less like travelers and more like ghosts emerging from the fog. Dr. Silas Mirth stood back near the bolted-down deck chairs, attempting to light a pipe, his attention, however, fixed on the Vanes. Lord Alaric looked utterly beaten, his shoulders slumped as he stared listlessly into the grey expanse. Lady Seraphine stood beside him, her posture rigid and unwavering. She was wearing a new, deeper shade of gloves, almost black, and Mirth noticed she had tucked her small, velvet bag discreetly behind her back, pressed against the railing. Then came the moment Mirth would replay in his mind for decades. Seraphine did not turn her body toward her husband, she merely leaned her head in, her elaborate hat a dark, sheltering dome, and she spoke. Mirth was too far away to discern the words, but the tone, low and urgent, carried a disturbing finality. It was not the voice of a wife offering comfort, but of a superior issuing an ultimatum. It was a cold, quiet pressure. Alaric's reaction was immediate and telling. His body stiffened, a sharp, involuntary spasm passing through his frame, as if struck by an invisible blow. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. He didn't argue or protest. He simply stared forward for a long, agonizing moment, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod beneath his downturned chin. The obedience was chilling. It spoke of absolute defeat and a prior, deeper understanding between them. A plan, a terrible compact that was now being finalized. Mirth felt a sudden, sharp clarity. This was not a moment of shared anxiety. It was the precise, terrifying culmination of a premeditated act. Before he could process the sheer dread of the realization, the fog, which had momentarily thinned, suddenly surged inward again, swallowing the Vanes whole. The command had been given. The execution was now inevitable. The fog, having intensified after Seraphine's whispered command, now performed a brief, dramatic act of revelation. A sudden, sharp breath of wind, a brief downdraft between the massive funnels, sliced through the vapor, creating a temporary, ghostly window of visibility. In that fleeting fraction of a second, Dr. Silas Mirth saw the critical, terrifying conclusion of the exchange. Lord Alaric Vane was no longer leaning on the rail. His posture had shifted violently. He was listing, his body momentarily unsupported. Lady Seraphine, her eyes fixed straight ahead, was performing a swift, almost practiced motion with her left arm, a movement that ended just as a dark shape, Alaric's hat, flickered briefly against the white railing. Then, he was gone. The wind vanished as quickly as it came, and the fog rushed back in, thicker and more absolute than before, sealing the space where Lord Alaric had stood. There was no splash, no cry. The thick air and the constant low thrum of the engine had swallowed all sound. Seraphine's reaction was immediate and utterly without panic. She shifted her weight slightly, pulling her left arm back to rest delicately on the railing, her velvet handbag now resting upon it. She waited precisely 3 seconds, then turned her face toward the deck, raising her hands to her cheeks. Her voice, when it came, was a piercing, perfectly pitched soprano of shock that finally cut through the silence. "My God!" she cried, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. "Alaric! He has gone over." Mirth rushed forward, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He saw only Seraphine, alone by the rail, her large hat now tilted just so, concealing her eyes. He knew, with a dreadful, cold certainty, that the movement he'd witnessed was not the desperate attempt of a wife to save her husband, but the practiced shove of a murderess claiming her inheritance. Lady Seraphine's shriek, though calculated, had the desired effect. It shattered the contemplative silence of the fog. Within minutes, the decks were swarming with crew. The massive bulk of the RMS Aquitania shuddered as the engines were momentarily slowed, a grave formality that suggested hope where there was none. Captain Ashworth, a man whose every movement spoke of duty and control, was instantly on the promenade deck. He was a practical man, a sailor who dealt in facts, and he regarded the frantic, sobbing Seraphine with professional detachment. His first question, directed to Dr. Silas Mirth, who had been the nearest witness, was curt and direct. "Did you see the man fall, Doctor?" Mirth, recovering his composure, hesitated. "I saw him at the rail, Captain." Then, in an instant, gone. The fog was a barrier to everything. He deliberately omitted the whispered command and the subtle push. He knew his accusation would be seen as hysteria against a grieving widow. He needed proof. The search was swift, thorough, and utterly futile. Lifeboats were readied but not launched. Not in this visibility, and not for a man who had likely been dead for minutes. Crew members scoured the decks and checked the public rooms, but Alaric Vane was nowhere. Captain Ashworth quickly assessed the situation. A gloomy, wealthy man, a sudden, opaque fog, and a large, indifferent ocean. The conclusion was inevitable, and convenient. He informed Seraphine, with professional solemnity, that her husband had likely succumbed to a temporary fit of melancholia, and chosen his own end. It was the easiest explanation, one that preserved the ship's reputation and required no further investigation. The logbook was duly updated. Lord Alaric Vane, lost overboard. The great ship resumed her full speed shortly thereafter, leaving the mystery, and the body, behind in the cold grey wake. Seraphine accepted the captain's verdict with a tragic, exhausted slump, the picture of a woman utterly crushed by fate. With Lord Alaric Vane officially declared a victim of melancholia, Lady Seraphine embarked upon her most crucial and most calculated performance. She did not retreat to her cabin in silent dignity. Instead, she chose a public grieving, one perfectly modulated to evoke sympathy without suggesting hysteria. She dressed in deep mourning black the following day, abandoning the striking ostrich plumes for a simple, heavy veil that nonetheless drew every eye. She spoke little, offering hushed, poignant anecdotes about Alaric's hidden sensitivities and his fear of the modern world, subtly reinforcing Captain Ashworth's verdict of suicide. She accepted condolences with a dignified, heartbreaking weariness, allowing the sheer injustice of the tragedy to speak for itself. Dr. Silas Mirth, ever the clinician, watched her carefully from a distance. A truly distraught woman, he knew, would be consumed by genuine chaos. Tears, confusion, the inability to focus. Seraphine, however, was in chilling control. Her eyes, though shaded by the veil, were dry. She ate small, meticulous meals. She moved through the ship's lounges with a slow, deliberate pace that screamed sorrow, yet her hands, clasped demurely, never trembled. Mirth found her perfection unnerving. Her grief was an impeccably tailored garment, flawless in its construction and utterly without genuine warmth. It was the performance of a woman who had rehearsed this moment, not one who was experiencing genuine, unexpected loss. Every tearless moment, every quiet sigh, only deepened Mirth's conviction that this was not a widow mourning a husband, but an heiress savoring a victory. The stage was set for her to leave the RMS Aquitania as Lady Vane, the tragic figure. Mirth was determined to find the flaw in her act before they docked. The existence of a photograph was an anomaly, a tiny piece of luck that the fog and the official report had failed to account for. Dr. Silas Mirth knew a single image, taken in that moment of thick visibility, would be a forensic document far more reliable than the fleeting memory of any human witness. He recalled seeing a shy young man, an amateur photographer whose bulky camera marked him as a dedicated enthusiast, setting up a tripod near the stern just before the fog became absolute. Mirth sought him out, finding him in the ship's cramped darkroom, carefully developing his plates. Mirth introduced himself not as an investigator, but as a physician interested in the unique atmospheric conditions of the Atlantic. He casually mentioned the tragedy and asked if the photographer, a Mr. Percival Hughes, had managed to capture the scene just prior to the unfortunate incident. Percival, flattered by the attention of a professional, proudly showed Mirth the print. It was the very image that anchors this tale. a haunting, monochromatic strip of the promenade deck, with a line of figures staring into the void. It was hazy, slightly underexposed, and yet, perfectly timed. Mirth purchased the print with a generous sum, citing its value as a scientific record. Back in the privacy of his cabin, he studied the image under his medical lamp. The photograph confirmed the arrangement. Seraphine positioned rigidly, Alaric slumped and passive. But it was the details Mirth zoomed in on that truly electrified him. At the exact spot where Lord Vane had stood moments before his final, fatal movement, Mirth identified a small, almost imperceptible smudge on the pristine white railing. It was too dark and concentrated to be seawater or fog residue. To the casual eye, it was nothing. To Mirth, the specialist in chemistry and human decay, it was the undeniable trace of a foreign substance, something viscous and dark, clinging to the wood. It was the first tangible piece of evidence of premeditation, an anchor point for his terrifying hypothesis. The photo was not just a record of a tragedy, it was a blueprint for murder. With the photograph secured, Dr. Silas Mirth turned his full attention to the silent, damning detail captured on the plate. The small, concentrated smudge on the white paint of the railing where Lord Alaric Vane had last been visible. This minuscule imperfection, ignored by the shy photographer and overlooked by the hurried crew, was, for Mirth, the entire case. He brought to bear all the clinical reasoning of his medical training. If Alaric had simply fallen, the rail would show a scrape, or perhaps the dispersal pattern of fog and seawater disturbed by his movement. This was different. This was a deposit. Mirth theorized that the substance had to be thick enough to resist the immediate wash of the sea spray and the wind, yet fluid enough to be applied rapidly. Drawing on his knowledge of pharmacology, he began to hypothesize. It could be tar, but the color was wrong. It could be blood, but the shape was too uniform. His mind settled on the small, dark vial he had seen Lady Seraphine carrying, the one she excused as medicine for her husband's headaches. Mirth knew that many powerful, fast-acting sedatives of the era, such as chloral hydrate or certain concentrated opium tinctures, were syrupy and dark in their pure form. If a small quantity of such a substance were applied to the rail, perhaps with one of her dark, gloved fingertips, it could have served a dual, sinister purpose. First, it would be a subtle lure, attracting Alaric's hand in his nervous state. Second, upon contact and subsequent rubbing of his eyes or lips, it would have induced a sudden, potent wave of dizziness and disorientation, moments before the actual push. The photograph had captured the residue of that substance, the physical trace of a chemical ambush. The smudge was not simply dirt, it was the residue of a knockout dose. It proved Seraphine had been prepared not just for a struggle, but for a chemically assisted obliteration. The RMS Aquitania docked in New York Harbor, and with the end of the journey came the resumption of Dr. Silas Mirth's life as a physician, but also the continuation of his private inquest. He was determined to solidify the motive behind the accident. While Lady Seraphine was busy completing the requisite legal formalities as the tragic widow, Mirth utilized his discreet connections within the city's legal and banking fraternities. He presented himself as a concerned party, acting on behalf of the deceased Lord Alaric Vane's extended, and naturally suspicious, family in London. The details Mirth uncovered were swift and damning. Alaric Vane, fearing his own failing health and convinced of his wife's singular focus on his money, had commissioned a new, complex will shortly before the voyage. However, Seraphine, with chilling foresight, had convinced him to include a specific, crucial clause: immediate and unconditional transfer of his vast liquid assets, stocks, bonds and cash, to her name upon his death if it occurred while traveling abroad, citing the need to bypass lengthy international probate. The discovery was a revelation. Had Alaric died in London, his estate would have been tied up for months or years, giving his family time to contest Seraphine's claims. By arranging his death mid-Atlantic, the time delay worked in her favor. She was now, effectively, sitting on an insurmountable fortune, with access immediate and absolute. The will itself provided the clearest motive. Seraphine wasn't interested in a slow gain. She engineered a clean, swift, and undeniable acquisition. The amount, Mirth learned, was staggering: enough wealth to insulate her from any suspicion or financial hardship for the rest of her life. The cold, financial logic of her crime horrified him. She hadn't killed for passion or revenge, she had murdered for paperwork. Safely back in his practice, Dr. Silas Mirth spread the evidence before him. The haunting photograph of the promenade, the copy of Lord Alaric Vane's financial stipulations, and his own detailed clinical notes on the couple's behavior. The pieces of the puzzle were disparate, but Mirth, the trained physician, possessed the logic to assemble them into a terrifying whole. His deduction was a three-part calculation of opportunity, chemistry, and timing. First, the opportunity, the fog. It was not a random element, but a seized chance. It provided a sound-dampening, sight-obscuring curtain that guaranteed the act would be unwitnessed and unrecorded. Seraphine's patience in waiting for the optimal atmospheric conditions spoke of her relentless preparation. Second, the chemistry. The smudge on the railing, visible in the photograph, was the silent smoking gun. Mirth calculated that a concentrated dose of a scopolamine-based sedative, easily obtained under the guise of treating Alaric's nerve complaints, would be syrupy and dark. Applied subtly to the railing, it would ensure that when Alaric, in his nervous state, leaned or grasped the rail, the drug would be transferred to his hand. A moment of rubbing his eye or licking his lips would introduce the agent, causing rapid disorientation, vertigo, and muscular weakness, the very listlessness Mirth had observed just before the incident. Third, the timing. The whispered command, Chapter 6, was the verbal cue, a final instruction to a husband too chemically impaired and emotionally defeated to resist. Seraphine needed only a minimal effort, a sharp, precise shove, to send the staggering magnate over the low rail. The fog would devour the splash, and the sedative would ensure there was no cry for help. Mirth realized the truth was far colder than simple homicide, it was a clinical, near-perfect execution. Lady Seraphine had used the world's grandest steamship as her stage, and the unpredictable Atlantic weather as her accomplice, crafting a murder that was designed, from the first step onto the deck to the last trace on the railing, to be mistaken for suicide. 7 years had passed since the voyage of the RMS Aquitania. The First World War was looming, and the grand, gilded era of luxury ocean liners was already beginning to feel like a distant dream. Dr. Silas Mirth had moved on, professionally successful yet perpetually haunted by the one case he could never bring to trial. His confrontation with Lady Seraphine Vane occurred not in a courtroom or a police station, but at a glittering charity gala in Newport, Rhode Island, where the wealthy sought to outspend one another in a final, frantic show of peacetime opulence. Seraphine, now known as the mistress of the Vane fortune, was the epitome of refined wealth. She had shed the theatrical mourning of her widowhood, opting instead for diamonds and a quiet, immutable self-possession. Mirth saw her across the ballroom. She was laughing softly, her face a mask of serene contentment. The large, grotesque hats had been replaced by elegant tiaras, but the chill in her eyes, the terrifying, calculating emptiness, remained unchanged. Their paths inevitably crossed near a fountain. Seraphine, recognizing Mirth instantly despite the years, did not flinch. She extended a cool, gloved hand, her smile practiced and brief. "Dr. Mirth," she murmured, her voice silk smooth. "How kind of fate to bring us together again. I often think of that terrible crossing. A life-changing tragedy." Mirth took her hand, his grasp firm and deliberate. He looked directly into her eyes, bypassing the polite mask entirely, focusing on the dark intelligence behind them. He spoke quietly, his voice pitched so only she could hear it over the orchestral music. "Indeed, Lady Vane. I often revisit the scene in my mind. The fog, the rail, and the singular smudge on the paint, a detail only a physician would truly appreciate." The smile did not flicker, but Mirth felt a momentary, razor-sharp tension in her wrist. A fraction of a second of pure, naked panic. She knew he knew. She withdrew her hand, her expression one of polite, confused dismissal. "A smudge? I'm afraid I don't recall. You must forgive me, doctor. The grief makes such minutiae indistinct." It was her final, defiant confirmation. She didn't deny the smudge, she dismissed the grief that would have made her notice it. Mirth simply bowed, a silent acknowledgement of her victory. She was untouchable, protected by wealth, time, and the very complexity of her crime. He walked away, leaving her to her champagne and her diamonds, knowing the secret of Lord Alaric Vane's murder would remain his personal, enduring burden. Dr. Silas Mirth never spoke of his theory to the authorities. The evidence, the photograph, the financial details, the medical deduction, was compelling, but it was circumstantial. Against the wealth and impeccable social standing of Lady Seraphine Vane, Mirth knew his suspicions, based on a smudge and a silent nod, would be dismissed as the overactive imagination of a neurasthenic physician. He could not risk his reputation on a case he could not legally win. The RMS Aquitania sailed on, carrying countless souls across the Atlantic, her history clean save for the one entry in the logbook: Lord Alaric Vane, lost overboard, melancholia suspected. The great ship, once the site of a profound personal horror, became a symbol of forgetfulness, its luxury masking the tragedy it had witnessed. Mirth kept the photograph locked in a safe deposit box, a silent, terrible diary of a crime. It became his personal anchor to the truth. Every time he looked at the black-and-white image, he saw not the dignified figures of the Edwardian era staring into the fog, but a woman executing a cold-blooded financial maneuver. He saw the precise moment innocence was surrendered for wealth. The story of the fateful voyage became Mirth's enduring burden. He was the only one who truly knew the terror hidden in the misty silence of that day in 1907. Lady Seraphine Vane lived out her life in comfort and high society, celebrated as the tragic, resilient widow, her secret buried beneath millions of dollars and a mountain of social graces. The photograph remains today, a haunting artifact of a bygone age, a seemingly innocent snapshot of a luxury liner. But for those who know the tale, the fog, the whisper, the smudge on the rail, it is the undeniable, frozen proof of a murder that vanished without a trace, leaving behind only an unpunished killer and the chilling silence of the sea.